Hey friends! Welcome back to the Animal Nerd Podcast. I'm your host, an absolute mad lad, and I am so happy that you are here. Today I'm going to share with you the story of a horse who was perhaps the rarest and most unique of her species to have ever lived. This is the story of Thumbelina. Our story begins in 2002, or possibly 2001, it was surprisingly hard to get a clear answer on that, at a miniature horse stud called Goose Creek Farm in St. Louis, Missouri, where a mare named Rosie is giving birth. This in and of itself is nothing unusual. The farm had only been operating as a breeding facility for a year or two, but even so, a foal being born wasn't out of the ordinary. The farm's owners, Kay and Paul Gosling, had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. This was not an easy birth. Rosie was clearly having a tough time, and when at last her foal entered the world, her owners assumed that it was stillborn. This tiny, still figure on the stable floor, no signs of life. But the Goslings weren't going to give up without a fight. Despite believing the foal to already be dead, they nevertheless began giving her mouth to mouth, and to their surprise and delight, they found that she was alive, just very weak and so tiny. So much so that they still weren't sure if she would make it. She weighed only 8 pounds, barely 3.5 kilograms, the same weight as a newborn human baby. I mentioned earlier that Goose Creek Farm is, or was, a miniature horse stud, and the miniature there isn't referring to the size of the farm, but rather to the horses they bred, American miniature horses. They're an absolutely adorable breed with the delicate proportions of a typical horse, just only a fraction of the size. Obviously the height of any horse is dependent on its breed, but for a riding horse the average height would be somewhere in the region of 15 or so hands. For those of you who didn't grow up as horse girls, that's about 5 foot or 150 centimetres, and as is commonly the case with quadruped heights, that measurement doesn't include their head or neck, because those parts tend to move about a lot, so to get an accurate and reliable height, you measure to the highest point that doesn't tend to vary when the animal is standing still, which is typically the top of the shoulders, which in horses is known as the withers. I'm sorry to all the horse nerds that I've just bored with those basic facts, but I thought it was useful information for those who might not be as familiar. And my point with all of this is that a typical riding horse will be anywhere from, say, 14 to 16 hands high. Most breeds under 14.5 would technically be considered ponies, but that's a whole other thing that isn't relevant to the story. Miniature horses are very much considered to be horses and not ponies, despite their small size. And their size really is small. The absolute maximum in the breed standard is 9.5 hands, which is 38 inches or 96 centimetres. Plenty of individuals are even smaller than that, coming in at less than 8.5 hands, which is 34 inches or 86 centimetres. Yeah, pretty much half the size of a typical horse. So a small foal being born at Goose Creek Farm wasn't unusual. They were all small, they were miniatures. But even by the standards of her breed, the foal was absolutely minute. And like a lot of other small animals, she made up for her diminutive size with her feisty spirit. Physically, this little foal may have been weak, but she was a fighter, and despite all the odds being stacked against her, she survived and thrived. But she didn't really grow. I mean, of course she did a bit, otherwise that would just be weird. But if the Goslings thought that this foal would eventually catch up with the other foals at the farm, they were mistaken. And it was clear that this wasn't just a horse who happened to be a bit shorter than her peers. There was something more at play here. Even aside from how short she was, her body was shaped very differently from a typical miniature horse's, even compared to her parents. Her legs were much shorter in proportion to her body than they should have been, and they were slightly bowed as well. I don't know the exact timeline of when it was confirmed, but it would turn out that the reason this foal was so tiny and differently shaped was because she had dwarfism. Dwarfism isn't totally unheard of in horses, but it is incredibly rare, and the fact that Thumbelina was specifically a miniature horse with dwarfism meant that she was absolutely tiny. So small that even though the paddock fencing at Goose Creek Farm had been designed with miniature horses in mind, she was still easily able to slip out underneath the bottom rung, meaning they had to add an extra wire underneath just to try and keep her contained, because otherwise she'd just sneak out and try to steal everyone's food. She was smaller than the spaniels who also called the farm home. And yeah, they named her Thumbelina after the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale character. Very fitting, as Thumbelina was a uniquely small and stunningly beautiful young woman, and this horse was a uniquely small and stunningly beautiful young filly. And she really was gorgeous, liver chestnut with a wide white blaze, and the biggest doe eyes you've ever seen with wonderfully long thick lashes. And because of the combination of being both a miniature horse and having dwarfism, one suspicion quickly arose in the mind of the Goslings. Could it perhaps be possible that Thumbelina was the smallest horse in the world? Well, in order to get an official answer on that, they had to wait until she was fully grown. And so in 2006, when Thumbelina was 5 years old, officials from the Guinness Book of World Records arrived at Goose Creek Farm to measure Thumbelina, and they confirmed that she was indeed the smallest recorded horse in history. She was only 17.5 inches taller than Withers. That's less than 45 centimetres. In horse speak, that's only 4 hands and 1 inch, less than half the size of a standard American miniature horse. And honestly, I feel like the only way to appreciate just how tiny Thumbelina was is to look at photos of her. Nothing else can really do her justice. So if you've never been lucky enough to see a picture of this girl, I would highly recommend giving her a Google, or an Ecosia ideally, when you have the chance. I know I keep going on about it, but even when you hear about how tiny she is, I feel like it really doesn't hit you until you actually see her. She is minute. She was actually smaller than most dogs, and in fact she slept in a plastic igloo-shaped dog kennel instead of a stable. She had some problems with her legs, and so she had to wear special orthopedic shoes, but other than that, she was, by all accounts, a happy, healthy little horse who would gallop around and play and buck like any other. And speaking of bucking, oh my god, did this girl have attitude. She absolutely ruled the roost at home, said to be the bossiest horse at the farm. And when her height was finally verified by the people from Guinness, they decided to bring along with them the world's largest living horse at the time, a Belgian draft named Radar who stood at an incredible 6'7", nearly 20 hands high. He was 40 times bigger than Thumbelina, 40. And naturally, they wanted to get some photographs of the two horses together to put in the latest edition of their record book. And Thumbelina was not happy about this. She was this pint-sized little pony trying to show a horse who could quite literally step on her like a bug who was the boss. Honestly iconic. As you can imagine, once Thumbelina had the official title of smallest ever horse, there was a lot of media attention around her, which of course resulted in people having an interest in buying her. I mean, after all, imagine how much money you could make from charging people to come and see her. But the Goslings vowed that they would never sell Thumbelina, not for any price. She was one of a kind, quite literally priceless. Their son Michael would joke that he thought his parents would be more willing to sell him than Thumbelina. And the Goslings even went a step further than just refusing to sell her, deciding that they would never make a single penny off of Thumbelina or her fame. They realised the ability Thumbelina had to bring joy to people, and they wanted to make the most of that and help as many people as possible, but they didn't feel comfortable charging people to see her, and they certainly didn't want to reduce her to some kind of sideshow. Before too long, Goose Creek Farm became something of a hub for local children, with Thumbelina regularly hosting everything from large school trips to one-on-one meetings with children who needed a little extra support in their lives, whether that was due to a disability, life event, or something else. We all know the healing power of an animal's unquestioning love and acceptance, and Thumbelina was no different. She had a knack for knowing who needed her the most and seeking them out, and she was always totally at ease even when surrounded by 100 or more children at once. It was as though she understood how much she helped people and seemed to really enjoy it. She never became stressed or anxious, she adored attention and was incredibly affectionate. According to Michael Gosling, the adult son of the farm's owners Kay and Paul, children who met Thumbelina didn't treat her as though she was an animal. Instead, they spoke to her as though she was a person, a friend and equal rather than just a horse. They would ask her about her likes and dislikes and invite her for sleepovers. She clearly had a strong effect on everyone she met, and the Goslings didn't want to keep it to themselves. Of course, they already had plenty of people coming to their farm to see her, but they knew that Thumbelina had the power to do even more good in the world, and this led them to create the Thumbelina Children's Tour. Basically, Thumbelina would tour across the US, stopping off at plenty of charities and organisations along the way, with the intention to both bring joy to as many children as possible, especially those who'd been through a rough time, but also to raise a total of $1 million for children's charities. And the list of charities and organisations that were benefited by the Thumbelina Children's Tour and the money they raised were far too numerous to list out in its entirety. But it included children's hospitals, special schools, camps, family shelters, children's homes, cancer charities, horse shows, fairs, therapeutic riding programmes, fundraisers, Ronald McDonald houses, children's centres, just anywhere at all that would benefit from a visit from an incredible little horse or from the money and awareness that she could raise for them. Over the course of her first tour alone, she raised well over $10,000 for worthy causes, although I couldn't find the final amount listed anywhere, so I don't know how close she got to her $1 million goal. Of course, putting on a tour of this magnitude was a hefty undertaking and pretty expensive, but the Goslings stood resolute in their vow to never make money off of Thumbelina. Instead, they founded the Thumbelina Charitable Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to making the children's tour possible, as well as helping facilitate various other ways that Thumbelina could help people, like the Thumbelina One-of-a-Kind Award, which was described as being for children who, quote, overcame their own obstacles in life to achieve wonderful things just like Thumbelina, end quote. Anyone could nominate a worthy child, and the winners received a special plaque and, most excitingly, a surprise visit from Thumbelina herself. The Thumbelina Charitable Foundation was funded through donations as well as sales of special Thumbelina colouring and activity books, but the only people who were ever charged a fee to see her were corporations and groups who wanted her for private events. And all of that money went into the Charitable Foundation and not the Goslings' pockets. The tour went on throughout most of 2007, completed in separate legs, with Thumbelina returning home to Goose Creek Farm in between to rest. And this little diva travelled in style. They travelled in what was known as the Thumbie-mobile, a 30-foot-long RV which had been converted into basically just a luxury horse box with all the mod-cons, including air conditioning. And it was stocked full of everything a tiny horse might need on her travels, her grooming kit, bedding, food, and of course her beloved little plastic doghouse, because as if this girl would be caught sleeping anywhere else. Thumbelina travelled thousands of miles over the course of her tour, returning to her home base of Goose Creek Farm in between each leg for some well-deserved R&R. Annoyingly, I couldn't find anywhere in my research whether or not Thumbie actually reached her goal of raising $1 million for charity, or whether her humans reached their goal, I should probably say. There was plenty of coverage when the tour first started, especially as this was about the same time she was verified by Guinness World Records, but there doesn't really seem to have been much in the way of follow-up. Likewise, the intention was to have a children's tour every year, and I also couldn't really find any coverage of them after the first one. But I'm pretty sure there were at least a few of them. Unfortunately, this was all over 15 years ago, and despite Thumbelina's international fame, not many details about these things were ever really preserved online. On top of all the charity events she did, Thumbelina was also in high demand for other events too. She was featured on talk shows, invited onto the field of the Chicago White Sox baseball team to rapturous applause, and she even paid a visit to the Kentucky Derby. Although she didn't actually compete in the race for obvious reasons, girl would have been a trip hazard. It just so happened that her trip here coincided with her birthday, and so she was invited to celebrate with a party held at the Kentucky Derby Museum. She was basically the horse version of a socialite. The Goslings were also adamant that they would never breed Thumbelina. I mean, even aside from the fact that it would probably put her own life in pretty intense danger, they also didn't think it would be fair to pass her genes on to future generations. They adored Thumbelina and she thrived under their care, but despite that they didn't feel it would be ethical to deliberately breed animals with a genetic mutation that could cause them to suffer. Honestly, I wish more people out there were that responsible. There are so many animal breeds and varieties out there that suffer for human aesthetic appeal. Yes, Munchkin cat breeders, I'm looking at you. Apparently Thumbelina wasn't super keen on the company of other horses, and I can't really blame her. I mean, even the other miniature horses on the farm were still all a foot or more taller than her. Instead, she much preferred the company of the Gosling Spaniels, who were much more her size and whom she loved playing with. Honestly, Thumbelina just sounds so cool. I mean, I know I think that about most animals, that's literally what this podcast is, but I just love the idea of this 1.5 foot tall horse bossing all the other horses around and joining a pack of dogs. I mean, you just know she absolutely would have been the alpha of that pack. Although Thumbelina's disabilities didn't affect her too much when she was younger, besides, affecting her in the sense that they made her an international celebrity with a charity and annual cross-country tour, as she began to age, Thumbie struggled a bit more, as is to be expected. She had more or less retired from travel by the time she was 13 years old, although she continued to host visitors at the farm. Over the course of her career, for lack of a better word, Thumbelina met thousands of children across the United States and brought joy to countless more people who discovered her through the internet. And, of course, she raised a massive amount of money for good causes too, fundraising for charities that would help children in need all around the world. She may have been small, but her impact was anything but. It had been theorised for a long time that Thumbelina's disability would shorten her lifespan, and sadly that would prove to be correct when she passed away in 2018, aged approximately 16. Again, I couldn't find much about this online, not even a specific date, let alone a cause of death. But long before she passed away, it was estimated that she would only live to be 17 or so, and that turned out to be pretty much exactly the age she was. So I suppose that must just be typical for a horse with dwarfism. And while 16, 17 wouldn't exactly be considered old for a standard-sized horse, it's still a good age. Thumbelina's disability may have shortened her life, but it was also that which allowed her to live such an incredible life, travelling the country and impacting so many lives and helping so many people. Like I said earlier, Thumbie may have been tiny, but her legacy was huge. Of course, since Thumbelina's passing, the title of smallest living horse has been handed down to other pint-sized ponies, but none of them have ever managed to break the world record of smallest ever horse, a title which Thumbelina still holds to this day. Will we ever see a horse shorter than the beautiful Thumbelina? Who knows? But if we do, you absolutely know I'm going to be here to tell you all about it. And in the meantime, there are plenty more animal stories to share, so you should totally subscribe to the show so you don't miss any of them. What a smooth segue! Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then it would really, really help if you could leave us a positive review in your podcast player, or if you're listening to this via YouTube, to like the video and leave a nice comment. It all really helps other people find the show, and as I said so many times, you're probably all fed up with it by now. If this podcast is ever able to make any money, then 100% of that will be donated to Animal Sanctuary The Little Rescue Zoo, which means you can help to support animals in need just by listening to the show, which is pretty cool. You can literally donate without having to spend a penny of your own money, just by listening to and supporting the podcast in any way you can. Speaking of which, if you'd like to share us with any animal-loving friends, then by all means please do. The more people listening, the more likely we are to be able to use this show to help rescue animals. As ever, for a list of all sources used in this episode, feel free to check out the show notes. That's also where you can find all of our links, social medias, email address, all the boring admin stuff. Thank you again to everyone who's been supporting the show in any way. It honestly makes more of a difference than you know, and it makes me so happy to know that there are people out there enjoying my silly little nerd program. It still kind of baffles me that there are people out there who want to listen to me ramble on about animals every week, and I am beyond grateful for each and every one of you, so again, thank you. And I think that's all for this week. I'll be back next Tuesday with a new episode, perhaps there'll be another bonus minisode in between, who knows. But until then, stay wild, friends.